key word. And the key word in chapter 37 in this first pit is conflict. I've found myself doing a good bit of premarital counseling over the last 6 or 8 months. I've probably counseled 5 or 6 couples. And one of the major things that I try to communicate in premarital counseling is simply this: there will be conflict, and you have to learn how to deal with it. If you're not yet married and you're in this room tonight, don't enter into marriage thinking there will be no conflict. You married folks, is there conflict in marriage?
Every day.
You raised both hands. Okay, he raised both hands. There is absolutely conflict in marriage. It's unavoidable. Now, the level of conflict and how you deal with conflict is up to us, right? But there will absolutely be conflict in marriage. Will there be conflict in the church?
Absolutely.
Why? Because there are people in the church, right? Will there be conflict in families?
Yes.
Absolutely. Why? Because there are people in families, right? Conflict is inevitable. How we deal with conflict, that is the situation. How are we going to deal with conflict? Are we going to do it like the brothers did it and use malice? I want you to go to Ephesians chapter 4. Inevitably, what I do in premarital counseling is take folks to Ephesians 4, because did you know Ephesians 4 gives us a roadmap for navigating conflict? If you'll go to Ephesians chapter 4 and pick up with me in verse 25, here is the roadmap for overcoming conflict. You ready? Verse 25 says, "Wherefore, putting away lying, let every man speak truth with his neighbor, for we are members one of another." Number one thing when it comes to conflict, tell the truth. Do not lie. Do you know people who will lie to attempt to get out of conflict? That's one of the main reasons people lie, isn't it? I have been potentially caught at something, and to avoid this conflict, I'm going to lie as an attempt to avoid conflict. I've counseled one particular person who is an admitted pathological liar. And you know why he lies? Because he despises conflict. And he feels like lying is a way to skirt conflict. Now, inevitably, what happens?
You get caught and there's conflict.
It causes more conflict, right? But he had convinced himself that lying was a means to avoid conflict. So the very first thing that Paul says in this context is don't lie. Okay, that's number one. Husbands and wives, don't lie to each other. Parents, children, don't lie to each other. I know parents who have no problem telling their children little white lies just to make the conversation easier. Don't lie to your kids. Don't lie to your spouse. Don't lie to your brothers and sisters in Christ. That is not a key to resolving conflict. Verse 26, "Be angry and sin not. Let not the sun go down upon your wrath." Do you have a right sometimes to be upset? Well, I hope so, because I get upset sometimes. But we can be angry and not sin. There can be conflict and not sin. Did Joseph's brethren have a right to be angry? Well, probably. Probably. But they could have done it without sin. Now, as we continue, notice what else he says. "Let him that stole steal no more, but rather let him labor, working with his hands a thing which is good, that he may have to give to him that needs." Verse 28, by the way, seems not to fit in this context, but what it is the principle of replacement. If you want to change behavior, you can't take a bad behavior out without replacing it with a good behavior. If you're a pathological liar and you try not to lie, you've got to replace it with something else. If you're an addict and you try not to be an addict anymore, you've got to replace it with a positive behavior. That's what verse 28 is telling us. And now verse 29, "Let no corrupt communication proceed out of your mouth, but that which is good to the use of edifying." Have you ever been in a conflict and you've let your mouth say things it shouldn't say in ways that it shouldn't say them? Well, that's what verse 29 is telling us. "That it may minister grace unto the hearers. And grieve not the Holy Spirit of God, whereby you're sealed unto the day of redemption." Paul adds stakes to this. Do you know that we upset the Godhead when we have conflict that we don't resolve properly? That's what he says there in verse 30. Now, verse 31, here's how this applies to Joseph and his brethren. "Let all bitterness and wrath and anger and clamor and evil speaking be put away from you with all" what? Malice. I want you to notice the roadmap to malice. Do you know, and I know husbands and wives who hate each other, who have malice in their hearts towards each other. I've seen them sit beside each other in a counseling session. I don't love him, I don't love her. You know how you get there? Look again at verse 31. Where does it start? Bitterness. Were the brethren bitter with Joseph? When bitterness festers, what does it do to you? Oh, it causes some awful, awful things to happen inside of you, doesn't it? How did Joseph's brothers go from frustration to murder? How does that happen? My wife and I have a saying that we've learned over years of ministry. Anybody is capable of anything under the right circumstances. You believe that?
Yes.
Is there Bible proof for that?
Yes.
Give me an example.
Judas.
Oh, Judas, okay. My favorite Old Testament example, anybody? David, a man after God's own heart. Lust, adultery, murder. How does the man after God's own heart end up murdering one of his most loyal soldiers? Yeah, how does he do that? He did the exact opposite of everything we've just read. He lied. He had bitterness, and all of these things that we've talked about, right? Let all bitterness and wrath and anger and clamor and evil speaking be put away from you with all malice. And then verse 32, be kind one to another, tenderhearted, forgiving one another, even as God for Christ's sake hath forgiven you. So we see, as it relates to conflict, we see these brothers who gave in to bitterness, wrath, envy, jealousy, and it all culminated in malice. Okay? But then, as I mentioned, we've got Reuben. And Reuben said, well, you know, I want to resolve the conflict, but I don't want to do it directly. I don't want to take care of this in the way that it needs to be taken care of. I want to take care of it the easy way. I want to take back channels. I want to go in through the back door and try to do this in a way where there doesn't really have to be any direct conflict. Let me suggest to you that in most situations, the best way to deal with something is directly. How many of you avoid phone calls at all cost? Raise your hand. You just do not want to make a phone call. Why make a phone call when a text will do? Y'all that way? I figured more people would raise their hands. Do you know in the generations coming up, I take kids on basketball trips, and we have 15 kids walk into a Wendy's, not a single one of them wants to order. They don't want to order. You know why? Because they've grown up. You can order on your phone, right? You can have it delivered. They'll bring it to the curb for you. You don't have to have direct face-to-face interaction with anybody anymore if you don't want to. And so we've become accustomed in our lives to avoiding direct conflict and direct confrontation. But I believe direct confrontation is sometimes, it's not that bad of a thing. In fact, Jesus said the same thing, right? How do you deal with a problem? Let's say that somebody has a problem with you, what do? You go to them, right? Or you've got a problem with them, Matthew 18. You go to them, right? That's the very first thing. You talk between you and him alone. If they hear you, you've gained a brother, right? You've resolved the conflict. How many times have you seen people with issues among each other go to Facebook? Or go to the water cooler at work? Or go to their in-laws, or their parents, or their friends, or whatever the case might be. Go to everybody but. They go to the preacher. They go to the elder. They go to everybody but the one person they should go to. And that's the person that it affects, the person that they have a problem with. You go with that person, but that's too direct a conflict, right? Reuben should have said, brethren, we're not doing this. Joseph, come on. We're going to get this fixed. But he tried to fix it in a passive-aggressive way, and he caused a whole other set of problems. Now, my wife is an administrator, And if she weren't nursing my middle child through wisdom teeth removal today, then she would be here and she would disagree with me just a little bit. There are times where you can work situations out without having to cause a massive disturbance, right? And absolutely, if there's a way to do it where you don't have to blow everything up, that's okay. I tend to like to just come in and, and then at least we can work it out, right? And it's all on the table, But my wife is an administrator who understands there's a time and a place, right? So I agree with that. But as we think about conflict resolution, we need to understand that we cannot allow bitterness to fester until it becomes what we see in Genesis 37. And then number two, we don't need to take Reuben's plan of action and try to fix things passive-aggressively and end up causing more problems than we had to begin with. Okay, so we see in this first pit, the pit of betrayal, and our key word is conflict. Y'all following me so far? Number two, we see the pit of falsehood. We go to Genesis chapter 39, and here we have the next situation. Now, some good things intervene, and we'll talk about them in just a moment. But in Genesis chapter 39, we have our next pit. In verse 7, it came to pass after these things that his master's wife cast her eyes upon Joseph, and she said, "Lie with me." What did Joseph do wrong? Nothing. Did somebody say? He was what? He was handsome. I can relate. I understand what that's like. I'm just joking, by the way. I'm also humble. No, I can't necessarily relate, but Joseph can't help that he was attractive to his master's wife. He can't control. What's he supposed to do? Scrunch up his face when she's around and look uglier? You just can't do that, right? So Joseph didn't do anything wrong. That's the point. But he refused, verse 8, and said unto his master's wife, "Behold, my master knows not what is with me in the house, and he's committed all that he has to my hand. There's none greater in the house than I am, neither has he kept back anything from me but thee, because you're his wife. How then can I do this great wickedness and sin against God?" Notice what he said. I can't do this against my master, and I know that if I do this, I've sinned against God. He's got it all right. Okay? And it came to pass, as she spake to Joseph day by day, that he hearkened not unto her to lie by her, or to be with her. And it came to pass about this time that Joseph went into the house to do his business, and there was none of the men of the house there within. This is the only time that Joseph maybe could have had better judgment. Did you notice in verse 11? What's the key in verse 11? Nobody else was there. Men and women, can I give you a piece of unsolicited advice? Avoid at every opportunity you can being put in situations that can potentially compromise you with members of the opposite sex. I'm not going to counsel a young lady alone in my office with the door closed. Not going to do it. Now, I might be as trustworthy as the day is long. I hope I am. The young lady across from me might be as trustworthy as the day is long. That doesn't matter. I don't want anybody's capable of anything under the right circumstances. My wife, as an administrator, you've got an in-service, and you're the principal is a male, and he says, "Hey, let's just hop in the car. We'll go to lunch together." And the whole group's going, but you and me will ride together. My wife says, "Thank you very much," but no. One instance early on in our marriage, she was teaching in Coffee County, and she went out to eat with her brother. In Coffee County, though, we're from Warren County. Somebody that she knew saw her eating at Cracker Barrel or somewhere with this strange man. Who's the next one to find out? Me. And I trust my wife implicitly. She didn't tell me she was eating with her brother, but it wouldn't have mattered if she had. I don't care. I trust her completely. But she had to say, I was eating with Arzy. That's all it was, Now, that was completely innocent. She has every right to eat with her brother if she wants to. But we need to understand that we don't need to open the door for sin. But even in this, I can't say that Joseph definitively did anything wrong, right? Well, and she caught him by his garment, verse 12, saying, "Lie with me." And he left his garment in her hand and fled and got him out. I can see him doing the shirk out of the jacket thing and sprinting out the door. Okay? So Joseph did nothing wrong. He did nothing absolutely to deserve that situation. In verse 13, it came to pass when she saw he had left his garment in her hand, was fled forth, she called the men of the house and spake unto them, saying, See, he's brought into Hebrew unto us to mock us. He came in with me to lie with me, and I cried with a loud voice. And it came to pass when he heard, I lifted up my voice and cried. He left his garment with me, fled, and got him out. See, she set him up and she lied about him. And he ends up in prison because he did nothing wrong. The word that comes to mind about in this circumstance is crisis, right? When we think about things happening that are outside of our control, maybe you have had crises in your life. Maybe they're health related, maybe they're relational, maybe they're financial, maybe they're spiritual. But you've had something happen in your life that you could not control and you did not know how to respond. Have you ever asked yourself, why did this happen to me? This isn't fair. I teach teenagers every day in high school English. I hear that a lot. That's not fair. Now, they really have no concept of what fair is and isn't, right? Does fair mean that you treat everybody the same? Oh, no, it actually does not mean that. My kids, I told you, they're all different, right? I treat our kids differently, but I treat them fairly. Sydney Jane, we found out early on, physical discipline didn't do anything to her. She would take a deep breath, go get a drink of water, act like it never happened. She was amazing. It didn't matter what you did to her. But if you make her sit down and write something 100 times, she would want to poke her eyes out before she was finished. Now, with my two boys, physical punishment worked just fine. Right? It depends on the kid, right? You discipline different kids in different ways. Teachers know this, right? You deal with different kids in different ways. If you try to treat every kid the same in a classroom, then you're not going to be very successful. Bosses at work, you know this, don't you? Maybe you motivate different workers in different ways, right? You have to deal with different people in different ways. In the church, you know this too, right? You got to watch out how you handle sister so-and-so because she's sensitive or because this or that. But man, you can really rib brother such and such. You deal with people differently, but that's fair. Fair doesn't mean the same. Do what?
There's a difference between equally and equitably.
Equally and equitably. The illustration I give my students at the beginning of every year, let's say that little Johnny does all of his work as diligently as he can. He works really hard, and at the end of the semester, he has a 92.4. He needs 0.1 point to have an A. Little Susie has slept through my class, missed about half of it, barely turned in any work, and she has a 69.4. She needs 0.1 point to make a D. Which one might I help? Is that fair? Is it fair in that circumstance to help one and not the other? I think it is. One's trying and one's not, right? And so I ask my students, is that fair? Half of them will say, well, absolutely not. Well, that's okay. That's the half that's not doing anything. There you go. Fairness. But you know, life isn't fair, is it? The sooner that we teach, be careful. What time am I supposed to be done, by the way? 1:45? Be careful, parents. We love our kids, don't we? We love our grandkids, don't we? Be careful how much we shelter our kids and our grandkids. The more fully our kids learn that life isn't fair, the better equipped they will be to handle life. I think part of the issue with our young people today is that they've been so sheltered. You know, the jokes go around, you know, I grew up in the generation where you drank out of a garden hose, right? In summer, here's how my summer day went, right? You get up at whatever time you wake up and your mom says, first thing she tells you is what? No, get out. It was get out On a summer day, my parents were teachers. In the summer, get out. Okay, when do you come back? When the street lights come on. What did you do? What did you do? Well, whatever. You did whatever, right? That was sort of the way that I grew up. I wouldn't think about doing that with my kids today. Kick them out at 8 o'clock in the morning and see you at 7:45. Here's a bike. Go drive across the 4-lane. We don't care. Drink out of that. Oh, it's got that garden hose has got some sort of carcinogen in it. Don't drink out of that thing, right? Here's bottled water. Here's triple filtered water. That's the kind of, see the difference of how we've approached life for so long. This idea, I think our kids have become convinced of, that life is supposed to be fair. And then something inexplicable happens and they don't know how to deal with it, right? Matthew 5:45 says it rains on the just and the unjust. It only sprinkles on the hypocrites, by the way. But it rains on the just and the unjust. The point is, the same thing happens to both. But when it really gets tough? When it really rains on one person and there's just a little sprinkle on somebody else. And you say, well, why do they have this going on and they don't? Do you know people that seem to get an extra helping of suffering? I know some of those people. There are some people that everything they do turns to gold. You know those people? They sneeze on something and then they sell it and they make a profit, And then you have these people, everything they touch turns to dust, right? And they can't ever seem to get out of their own way. Nothing ever seems to go right. And we know those folks. And they look around and they say, life isn't fair. Joseph was in danger of being that person because he's in prison and did zero to deserve it. Isn't that the question of Job? You know what Job's fundamental question is? Why? Why? Does God ever answer Job's question? No. No, he doesn't answer the question. He says, where were you? And then Job repents. God never answers Job's question. You know why? Because it can't be answered. Not in any way that Job can understand it. Why do good things happen to bad people and bad things happen to good people and sometimes bad things happen over and over to the same people? Why does that happen? I can't explain it on this side of eternity. If there's one thing that we wrestle with as human beings, that's it, and I can't explain it. Except to say that God didn't create a world like that. Sin created a world like that. And now we're living in a world created by sin, not by God. Well, and that's what Job said, right? Which brings us to the next point. What is our response? We can't control what happens in life. All we can control is how we respond. We can control how we react when these things happen. Joseph is now powerless, absolutely powerless. He's in prison for something completely out of his control. And the only thing that Joseph can do is decide to live how he is supposed to live. You mentioned the Lord gives and the Lord takes away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. In all this, Job sinned not, nor charged God foolishly. That's Job 122. And in Job 2 and verse 10, in none of these things did Job sin with his lips. Now, Job asked a whole lot of questions, and he exhibited a whole lot of frustration. But I'll submit to you that there's not really that much wrong with that. The book of Psalms is replete with questions. Why? Life sometimes isn't fair, and the best we can do is respond properly. You know, Elijah dealt with that. 2 Kings 18, that contest with the 450 prophets of Baal. And he exhibits such strength. He's so strong, so committed to God, so faithful. And then one chapter later, God, kill me. I'm no better than my fathers. Well, Elijah, what's wrong? Well, God, you know what's wrong. I've been very zealous for the God of my fathers. And I only am left. and they seek my life to take it away. Elijah has given in to the, oh, woe is me, the pity party mentality, right? But is he the only one who's ever done that? No. Elijah did exactly what God told him to, and he was hunted for it. Because life sometimes isn't fair. Now God swooped in, 2 Kings 19, and said, okay, Elijah, I've got somebody coming to take your place. I'm going to replace the king of Syria, and you're not alone. And we need to understand that God is still there as well, and we'll talk more about that as we move through. So pit number 1, the pit of betrayal. Pit number 2, the pit of falsehood. Pit number 3, the pit of neglect. We continue in Genesis chapter 39, and here we see, go to chapter 40. So he's in prison, and we skipped over some stuff that we'll talk about here in just a minute, and I'm slowly feeling like I'm running out of time, even though I have an hour. So we'll have to kind of pick it up a little bit. So 2 people he meets in prison. Who are they? Okay, butler and baker, King James says. Yes, so butler and baker. All right? And he's got a different message for each of them. They have a dream. He interprets the dream. For the butler, what's he say? You're going to be restored to your place. But he says, he asks something of him. What is it? Remember me. When you are restored, remember me. And I'm sure the butler was like, oh, absolutely. Yeah, no problem, no problem, no problem. Of course, he tells the baker, your head's going to be gone here before too long. And that's exactly what happens. Now, what does the last verse in chapter 40 say? Is it? He did not remember him. How would you feel? You did absolutely nothing to deserve to be in prison. Here's your chance, right? The butler's going to be delivered, and he's got some pull with the powers that be. He can get you out of jail. But he forgets. How would you feel? I know how I would feel. I would feel like I was betrayed. I would feel bitter. What do you say to Joseph when the suffering becomes constant? Every time something good happens, boom, another punch in the gut. And what do you say to Joseph in a moment like that? See, as we think about it, what happens when people betray your trust? I began this lesson by asking that question. You ever had anybody betray your trust? Talked about marriage. Why is it that adultery is the only cause for divorce and remarriage? Why did Jesus give that allowance, do you think? Because it destroys trust, right? That act, as much as any other act, destroys trust. And God knew that the building block of any relationship was mutual trust. I tell young people all the time, if you can't trust the person you're dating, why are you dating them? But lots of young people are dating people they can't trust. And unfortunately, who do we end up marrying? Who we date, almost without fail. Right? So when we date people that we can't trust, inevitably we will marry someone we can't trust. And that's a recipe for disaster. But people betray our trust all the time. Even well-meaning people sometimes betray our trust. I'll never forget, I went to Short Mountain Bible Camp. We'd only been married 2 or 3 years, right? We moved here having been married a year, and immediately they said, we need help at Short Mountain Bible Camp. Danielle and I went that first year. The second year, she was teaching, and she was an in-service, and she couldn't go. So I went by myself. And I opened up my suitcase that she had packed for me. Bless her heart. And with every outfit, she put outfits together. Bless her heart. With every outfit, there was a letter. Bless her heart. That said, I love you. I read the first 2. I didn't even open the last 3 letters because I was busy. You know how camp is, right? You get busy, don't you? All those little rugrats running around you're in charge of, you get busy. I came home, she opened my suitcase, and 3 of those letters unopened. How do you think she felt? Wow. She might still not be over that. I don't know. That's been 20-something years, and it still might be fresh in her mind. What do we do when people betray our trust? What do we do? You know, Paul dealt with that. 2 Timothy chapter 4, if you begin in verse 9, I think it's verse 10, he says, Demas hath forsaken me, having loved this present world. I don't know what Demas did, but I don't know that it's something outrageous, except Demas chose the world over Paul. And by extension, chose the world over God. You ever had people do that? They chose something else over you. And you feel that sense of betrayal. And in fact, Paul goes on to say in 2 Timothy chapter 4, at my last answer, no man stood with me, but all men forsook me. And you can almost sense the discouragement in Paul's voice. By the way, what's about to happen to Paul in 2 Timothy 4? He's about to die. And he looks around and he says, only Luke is with me. He's neglected. Our older folks are neglected sometimes, aren't they? My father was in a nursing home, and one of the things I regret, I went to see him when I could, but I should have done more. Don't you always, with your older family members, feel like you can do more? With our older members of the church, can't we do more? They're neglected, right? People are neglected. Loneliness is one of the worst things to be saddled with. And we understand just how hard it is to be neglected. What happens when people betray our trust? What happens when people wrong us repeatedly? Nothing creates bitterness more than repeated wrongs. And see, here's the thing about relationships, right? Let me ask you a question. Do people change? Let me ask you another question. Can people change? What's the difference between those two questions?
Choice.
Do you even remember what the first one was? Are you asleep? Okay. Can and do. Okay. Do most people change? I mean, maybe. I think that our personalities are on a scale, right? And there's a low threshold and a high threshold, and we can move within that threshold. But listen, if your husband is bad at putting the laundry up when you get married, if we fast forward 20 years, how much better is that going to be? Just be honest. How much better is it going to be? Not much. If your wife is not a good house cleaner early on in your marriage, you fast forward 20 years, how much better is she going to be? Not much. Not much. Because that's probably who she is, right? That's who he is, right? And you better either learn to live with it, or y'all better figure something out. Now that's true about things that annoy us, like not putting the toilet paper back on the roll, or putting the little bitty put of milk back in the fridge instead of just drinking it and throwing it out. Right? Or getting something out that's expired and putting it back in the fridge. But the point is, by and large, people don't change that much. And so we feel like we're wronged repeatedly, right, in relationships. People in the church maybe behave the same way over and over again, right? And we eventually say, well, I'm just not dealing with them anymore. And it happens in relationships of all types. But it's interesting, Peter came to Jesus with a question, how oft shall my brother sin against me and I forgive him? And then Peter was being generous when he said what? 7? 7 sounds like a good number, doesn't it? And Jesus said, not till 7, but 70 times 7. What would you do if the same person did the same thing to you 70 times 7 times? What would your capacity or mind be to forgive? Is Joseph beginning to feel that way in his life, you think? I think so. And we understand our obligation to try to navigate that in the best possible way we can. So, there's the 3 pits. Any questions or comments? Now let's change the tone a little bit and let's look at the 3 peaks. Peak number 1. I promise you it's coming. The peak in Potiphar's house, right? Y'all just give me the long and short of it. What happens in Potiphar's house? He becomes what? The head of the household. He becomes the steward of the whole house. And so essentially, he's the one who controls everything that, what did he tell? We've already seen what he tells Potiphar's wife. Nothing comes in and out of this house except it goes through me. He touched everything that went on in the business world in that house. The only thing he couldn't touch, Potiphar's wife. That's how much power he had. That's after being thrown in a pit and sold into slavery. That's a peak, right? Well then, Potiphar's wife lies about him and he ends up in prison. Only, in chapter 39, verses 22 through and 23, to be the head of the prison and all of the prisoners to be put under Joseph's charge. Well, he's forgotten about. Eventually the butler, I remember, chapter 41. And he's called for. He interprets a dream. And it ends up being what? He becomes the second in command in not a prison, not in Potiphar's house, but in all of Egypt. Now, those are the peaks. How does that happen? All right. In my estimation, there are two phrases that go into this, and they're both in the text. The first one shows up a handful of times, and it came to pass. What does that mean? It came to pass. It happened. I think actually that's not even a literal translation of the Hebrew. The Hebrew just says it was. So this was, then this was, then this was. The point is, stuff happens. Things happened. We say it is what it is, which as a grammar teacher, that's a nonsensical statement. You have pronouns that don't refer to anything. The sentence makes no sense, right? But that's part of the point, right? It is what it is. It's inexplicable. We can't explain it. Things just happen, right? And so over and over we have this statement, it came to pass. But when you combine that with another statement, the Lord was with Joseph. Whatever came to pass, the Lord was with him. It came to pass, the Lord was with him. It came to pass, the Lord was with him. And over, we see that formula. Now, what do we call that? You called it providence. Now, providence isn't a word we find in Scripture, but we certainly see what that describes. God will provide. What Abraham told Isaac as he went to offer him. God will provide himself a sacrifice. Providence, God's ability and willingness to do for us. Now, providence usually describes God doing things for us how? You could be a smart aleck and say providentially. But what does that mean? Doing things for us within the scope of man's actions and decisions, within the scope of natural law, which I'll submit to you shows more about God's power than God just doing a miracle. God could do that. But God using the actions and the decisions of people to accomplish His purpose, I think shows even more power than anything else. And so we see then God's providence. That's exactly what we see. We see God's providence over and over and over again throughout the pages of God's Word. The most popular example used in the Old Testament, Esther 4 and verse 14, Mordecai said, who knows whether you were put here for just such a time as this, right? He tells Esther, you can be an instrument of God's providence, or you can be judged and He'll find somebody else. And that's the way that you and I should look at our lives. I can be used by God's providence no matter where I am, in a prison, no matter where I am, at the height of Potiphar's house, at the height of Pharaoh's house, in a pit. Paul said it this way, I've learned in whatsoever state I am, what? Therewith to be content. Contentment says God can use me wherever I am. So I'm going to do the best that I can. God's providence. But God's providence has to be connected with something to benefit us. What is that? And we see it in Joseph's life. Our character. Joseph always seemed to come out ahead because God was with him and Joseph conducted himself in the right way. If Joseph had not been the kind of man that Joseph was, I can't say that it would have turned out the way that it turned out. My philosophy has always been, I've taught my children this, and I believe this: if you do the work, good things will happen. I think that's true in every circumstance. I know y'all have done some evangelism things recently. Morrison has tried to really focus on evangelism over the last year and a half. Now, the first thing we did when we sat down with the elders and they said, what are we going to do? You know, we need to pick a plan, right? Well, we had a deacon who had a plan, and it wasn't a plan that everybody else used, but he said, here's what I think we could do. And my philosophy is, let's do something, and let's see if it works. Because doing something is always better than doing nothing. But our character, our actions, our involvement, plus God's providence can do wonders. Right? People say, well, should we use this material or that material? Should we bring this fellow in to help us or that? Just do something. As long as it's scriptural, just get to work. Just get to work. And if you do it, good things will happen. We see it in Matthew chapter 25, right? The parable of the talents. That's what it's all about. The Lord provided for them before He left, based on their several ability. But they had the obligation to make use of what He'd provided, based on their abilities. You have one man who did, another man who did, and then a man here who was too afraid to do anything with it. If Joseph had been the one-talent man, his life would not have turned out the way it did. God's providence plus our character. That's the important part. But what is the purpose of these peaks? In the time that we have left, I'm going to give you 3 things that I think are the foundation of everything that happened to Joseph. Why did Joseph's life turn out like it did? What was the purpose behind all of this? I think number 1 is the stated purpose that Joseph gives in Genesis chapter 50. And what a great perspective that Joseph had. You meant it for evil, but God meant it for good, as it were, to save much people alive this day. What happened because Joseph was put in charge of Egypt? What did that allow to happen? He saved his family from the drought and the famine. Now, because his family was saved from the drought and famine, what else happened? Let's take the broad view here. The lineage of Christ was preserved. By the way, the same thing that happened in Esther. Israel was in danger of being exterminated in Genesis, in Esther, and several other times throughout God's history. But God always providentially found a way to preserve the seed line of Jesus. You see, and that's what you see here. The purpose of this, number 1, we can't lose sight that Jesus is going to come from this. Right? Well, He saved Egypt, He saved His people, Israel, and He preserved the seed line of Christ to save much people alive. I think that's the primary purpose that we see, the stated purpose in Genesis chapter 50, verses 19 and 20. But number 2, what about Jacob? I don't want Jacob to get lost in all this. Go back with me to Genesis chapter 37. What a sad state of affairs. Now you could say that Jacob made his own bed, right? And I think there's some truth to that. But Jacob didn't deserve the things that happened to him. But pick up with me in verse 34. So now they've come and they've said, Joseph is dead. Here's the coat. It's full of blood and all of that. And in verse 34, and Jacob rent his clothes and put sackcloth upon his loins and mourned for his son many days. Verse 35. And all his sons and all his daughters rose up to comfort him, but he refused to be comforted. And he said, I will go down into the grave unto my son mourning. And thus his father wept for him. What did Jacob just say? I'll never stop mourning for my son. Never. Deeply, deeply affected. In the course of this narrative, though, there's a statement that is made to Jacob that I think is very interesting. I want you to pick up in Genesis 46, verse 1. It says, "In Israel," who is that? That's Jacob. "Israel took his journey with all that he had and came to Beersheba and offered sacrifices unto the God of his father Isaac. And God spake unto Israel in the visions of the night and said, Jacob, Jacob. And he said, Here am I." By the way, I've always thought that was funny, the way that God interacts with people. Did it with Samuel too, right? He says, "Hey, Samuel." And Samuel says, "Here I am." It seems kind of clunky, but it's always how it was. So, that's just an observation on my part. Anyway, he says, verse 3, "I am God, the God of thy father. Fear not to go down to Egypt, for I will there make of thee a great nation." And if you underline in your Bibles, I want you to underline verse 4. "And I will go down with thee into Egypt, and I will also surely bring thee up again, and Joseph shall put his hand upon your eyes." What does that mean? Joseph will be there when you die. Jacob has just spent a good portion of his life convinced that Joseph is dead. And now God is telling him, Joseph, the son whom you love, will be at your side when you die, and he'll be there to close your eyes. We can ask for nothing more in this life than to be surrounded by the people we love when we pass. And God promised Jacob that he would have that opportunity. Everything turned out okay for Jacob. But think about the mourning that he went through in the meantime. And I see that as one of the greatest underlying ideas in all of this account of the life of Joseph. And then finally, number 3, this provides a roadmap for you and me. What about the invitation? Are we doing that later, now, never, what? Are we coming back and doing an invitation of any sort? Okay. This is it? This is it. It's now or never. And whether we do an invitation proper or not, it doesn't matter. As we look at Joseph's life, just like when we look at any of the people that are characterized in Scripture, we ought to take something from it for you and me. James describes the perfect law of liberty like a mirror. And when we look at it, we don't see what we want to be, what we think we could be. We see what we actually are and then what we should be, right? When you look at Joseph, you see a man unflappable in the face of suffering. I do not know what you might be going through tonight. We've talked about a whole litany of things, haven't we? We've talked about marriages. We've talked about parenting children. We've talked about problems in the church. We've talked about financial issues. We've talked about all sorts of things, right? I don't know what you're going through, but I know this. God is a God who can see you through any of the pits that you might deal with in your life. I can't guarantee that your life will be free from trouble. But I can guarantee that there is a God who can reward you when this life is over and who will see you through all of those difficulties if you will just follow Him. Matthew 6:33 says, "Seek ye first the kingdom of God and His righteousness, and all these things shall be added unto you." You'll have what you need if you just follow Him. "There hath no temptation taken you but such as is common to man, but God is faithful, who will not suffer you to be tempted above that you're able, but will with the temptation also make" what? A way of escape, that you may be able to bear it. That's Joseph. Every trouble had a way of escape. And so it is for you and me. We can throw our hands up in the air and we can say, "I give up." Or we can devote our lives to serving God, and I guarantee that your life will turn out better. This evening, I hope that if you're not a Christian, you'll look at the life of Joseph and you'll understand his devotion to and his faith in God is what saw him through every single pit in his life. And if you are not a Christian tonight, you just don't have that. Everybody's going to deal with suffering. I'd hate to do it alone. but with the church. What a wonderful blessing and opportunity we have. It is now 7:45. Is it time for me to quit? All right. Thank y'all.